Hi everyone, my name is Ameera Moore and welcome to Lecture 3 of the Australasia Debate Training Initiative. So today I'll primarily be going through argument construction as well as speaker roles. So without further ado, I will now share my screen so that you guys can have a look at the PowerPoint I've got ready. All right, so as mentioned before, this is Lecture 3. I do highly encourage you to watch Lecture 1 and 2 just because I will be making references to those lectures as we go through this one. So firstly is an introduction to first speaker's role. The skeleton of a first speaker's speech is firstly definition, secondly is the policy to the motion that you are presenting, thirdly, burden, and lastly, arguments. Now we'll be going through this one by one. What do we mean by definition here? Now, definition is an explanation of what the words in the motion mean, so words in the topic. These tend to not necessarily be dictionary definitions per se, so not our usual conventional understanding of literal definitions of a word, but instead, they are words that would imply for a debate to be more functional. So for example, if the topic is this house would legalize gambling, legalize here rather than just it being allowed by a government or whatever the exact dictionary definition would be, you would instead define it as the activity of gambling being allowed and regulated by the government or a party that has been nominated by the government. So you can sort of explain a little bit as to how you imagine this legalization to look like, which brings us nicely into the second bit, which is about policy. Now, policy here means an explanation of how that policy would be implemented. So a step-by-step process. In other words, in debate jargon, we also call that mechanism. So for example, using the topic I mentioned before, which is this house would legalize gambling, first speakers should explain that the government will make it legal for those that are 18 years and above. So this would be inaccessible for those who are merely 14 or 15, that it could be an opt-in system, which means that people will need to opt into wanting to gamble and sign up, especially for first timers. You would need to maybe register your personal details into a national database so that the government has a track record of who are the people that are involved in gambling and what exactly is the demographic of people. So these are some of the step-by-step processes that you can include in your policy. So as you can see in the definition earlier on, I hinted at some of how that policy may look like. But as you actually go through the policy, you're going into even deeper detail as to how you imagine this policy to look like and how will it be played out. So that's what a policy would generally look like. Thirdly is burden. So burden is basically where the first speaker introduces to the judges the key things that you think your team needs to prove in order to win the debate. Now, obviously, the usual thought process to this is, wouldn't I need to prove everything? Shouldn't all of the arguments that I present be something that I manage to prove by the end of the day and win by virtue of having proven all of those arguments, right? But I think burden here means that all of your arguments should be linked to prove this one big thing. So for example, if your motion is this house would legalize gambling, and generally you feel like the key important areas or burdens you want to pick up on is that number one, this would ensure safer gambling, and secondly, that this would help the economy of the country. Then a lot of the arguments that you build will need to prove that. So firstly, you will prove those arguments, but at the end of the day, the overarching umbrella, the overarching burden that you want all of your arguments to prove is something that generally speakers tend to identify at the very beginning of their speech, so that it becomes easier for judges that even as they're listening to the arguments, they always ask themselves, why is this argument important? And then they think back about the burden that has been laid out by the first speaker, and then they go, all right, it makes sense. These arguments do answer this important question, this important burden that has been laid out by the first speaker. And then after that, you go into your arguments. And generally, speakers tend to outline these arguments first. So tell the judges, in my speech, I'll be presenting 3 arguments, which is argument A, argument B, and argument C, so that it's easier for judges to jot down what are the claims that you are going to make, so that as you are going through those arguments, they don't get lost as to whether or not you are talking about argument 1, 2, or 3. Yeah. So that's the general skeleton of a first speaker speech. Now going into the meatier part of this lecture, which is argument construction, or better known as also just like argument development. So before going into what is an argument in debate land, more importantly, we need to understand what an argument is not. So what an argument is not in debate land is an appeal to authority. So it's not very persuasive to come in and say that this argument is true because it was stated as fact in the penal code in, say, for example, Malaysia or whatever country you come from, right? So it's not a statement of fact by virtue of an authority that you are familiar with. Secondly, is that an argument is not an example. And this is where many judges will tell you in your career from time to time that you are arguing through an example, but you're not necessarily telling me the logic behind this example. So it's important to remember the example itself doesn't make the argument, but instead it is the logic behind that example or behind that parallel that is the argument. Thirdly is a set of questions with no answers. So I think a lot of debaters come into the debate with a whole bunch of questions like, why do we think this happens? Or why do you think this policy hasn't worked in the past, as a rebuttal or as an argument? Don't stop at that question. Be sure to also include some answers to it, because a set of questions with no answers is simply not an argument that will help you in the debate. Fourthly is rhetorical questions. Again, it's just another question without much answers that will be able to help you win the debate. And lastly is empty rhetoric. So I think a lot of debaters get away with, I think, having really fancy opening lines, and then for the rest of their 7 minutes, they just end up rephrasing that opening line and finding fancier ways to repackage that opening line. So I think it's really important to remember that although style is part and parcel of debate, having only style and having empty rhetoric doesn't substitute for you needing to have substance. Therefore, empty rhetoric is just not an argument. Now, key features to an argument. These are the 2 things that will be your pillars whenever it comes to argument construction. So it's really, really important to remember these 2 things. Number 1 is the question, is this argument true, right? And the second one is the argument important? You'll notice that that they're very basic questions, but at the end of the day, these are the 2 guiding questions that will help you, A, build an argument, B, help you attack an argument from the other side. So it's also important to remember that although these 2 things exist, they don't necessarily exist in equal parts all the time. So what I mean by this is that the ratio on how much to develop on each question purely depends on the type of argument you want to sell or the type of argument you are trying to bring down from the other side. Some arguments are just more immediately true than others, and some are more evidently important than others. So, for example, if the argument is that more people will end up dying if we allow for military intervention to happen, then I think if the argument's claim is that more people will die, then I think it's more evidently important that people dying seems to be a really big issue, and we ought to care about this, and this is an important issue. But whether or not it is true, whether or not this specific military intervention that we're talking about in this specific debate will in fact lead to more deaths as opposed to what the comparative may be, we don't know if that's actually true. So if you are presented with that kind of argument, maybe you want to spend less time on telling me why this argument is not important, but spend more time in telling me why this argument isn't true. And vice versa, if you face a different kind of argument. Some arguments may even have equal parts, where you would have to spend some time in developing whether or not this argument is true, and also whether or not this argument is important. But as a general rule, you should always have these two questions in the back of your mind as you're building anything in prep time or even in your rebuttals as the debate is happening. So argument development, I think a really good way to think about it is very much like building a house. You have to start at the very foundation and then build your way upwards. You need to ensure that all of the parts are linked to build a house that is solid and safe for you to live in. That even if it comes under attack, even if there are lots of rebuttals being thrown to this house that you're building, you would merely need to just do small repair work as opposed to having your house break down completely and then needing to build a new house every single time, right? So it's very important to make sure that the foundation of your house and the links to your house is solid. So I think that's a really good parallel to think of how you ought to approach argument development, and not get so excited into thinking of the conclusion, the endpoints of it, when you don't even have your links or your foundation to build upon. So what are the steps to argument development? I think before I go into these steps, I just want to make a disclaimer that this is not an exhaustive way to approach arguments, nor is it necessary that you follow it in this specific chronological order. However, having said that, I do think that following in this chronological order, or having at least these questions, they do give you a good starting point to venture into the world of argument development. And then once you get the hang of these steps, then it becomes a lot easier for you to maneuver and figure out what are the better questions that better suit your own style of argument construction. Right. So number one is you need to think about what is the starting point or background story of your argument, right? So you always want to think of an argument as telling a story, right? And you always want to tell a story from point A. You want to tell the before part of the story that explains a little more context before you can make claims about harms or benefits, right? Because if you just jump into an argument and you go, okay, here are the harms or benefits. Like as a judge, judges are thinking like, hold up, I don't understand. How do we get to this point? Like, how did people behave before? What is the starting point of this argument? You're jumping straight to the after picture, the after your policy, but you've never told me what did the world look like before your policy, right? So the starting point, the background story is basically the before picture, the before world of your policy. So this is also known as a premise. So if you ever hear the word premise out there being thrown in debate land, what it really means is that the starting point of your argument, the very foundation of it all, before you can even make any claims about how your policy makes things better. Secondly is, why is the starting point or background story true? Because you can't just merely assert that a background story is a fact, right? Or that it's true. You actually have to do the work in convincing the judges that your before state is in fact true. So I think a good way to think about how to explain the before picture is to ask yourself, how do the stakeholders think? Like, what did they feel before your policy? What was the state of living they were in? What drives them to act and make decisions in the past? And I think these sets of questions that really studies the psyche of your stakeholders and what is the carrot and stick approach that they are very likely to respond to is also known as incentives. So yeah, you can generally just jump in and be like, here are the reasons why we think this is true, because here are the incentives of which these people respond very well to. All right. The third thing is, what are the harms and benefits to this argument? So I think this is quite self-explanatory in the sense that this is the part that debaters usually jump immediately to, right? The claims that you want to make, the benefits that your policy tend to provide in the debate. You also need to remember that you need to prioritize your harms and benefits, because not all harms and benefits are important. Like, some benefits are probably true, but are probably really petty and not really debate winning, nor is it worth spending your time on when you need to be building on something that is a lot more foundational and core to the case of your team. So I think a good practice to figure out whether or not your harm or benefit is something worth investing and spending a lot of time building on is link it back to the motion. So a good practice would be try saying, this house believes that, and then insert the motion and then add in the word because, and then add in the claim that you are trying to make. So I think that's a good formula. It's like motion, because, heading of your argument. And then if it sounds really weird or it makes you laugh, then you're probably going to realize that this is probably a really silly claim to make. But again, this is just a merely trial and error process. Obviously, if you end up coming up with a name of the claim that doesn't sound very compelling, but actually the content of that claim is very compelling, then don't immediately give up on that argument. So it's really important to also build on that argument before you choose to disregard it. But this is just like a good hack to think on just like a first view basis, whether or not this is a good argument to run. Fourthly is, how do these harms or benefits happen? So I think a lot of the times debaters make the claim of the argument without wanting to paint a picture to the judge. How do those benefits and those harms happen? Walk the judges through them step by step. And I think this is where you also hear words like, the judges felt like you didn't provide any mechanism or any link, causal link. You didn't mechanize your argument. What that really means, all of that is basically, you didn't provide a process. You didn't tell me the step-by-step process of how we got from the before picture, why your picture is true, the insertion of your policy and how your policy benefits us, but how does that benefit play out? So you need to take it one by one and walk the judges through this new world that you envision is supposed to bring us all of these benefits. So be sure to provide those links. I would say that this is one of the really important parts in argument construction. More important than the claim itself is telling me how that claim happens and why that claim is in fact true. So after you're done doing that, the fifth thing you want to do is explain to the judges why this harm or benefit is important. Because as mentioned before, not all harms or benefits are equally important. You need to narrate to the judge why you think this specific harm and this specific benefit you are selling is in fact debate winning. So I think when you ask yourself, whether or not this is important by virtue of whether or not you think this affects more people, or maybe even if it affects a smaller number of people, it affects them in irreversible ways, in ways that, numbers doesn't matter. It's about the magnitude of the pain that they feel, or, maybe this is something that is very time sensitive. These are all different ways in which you can impact your argument by saying why it's important. I think this is another jargon that we hear in debating, which is like, you didn't impact your point. What does it mean to impact the point? When judges say that, what they really mean is that they want to hear why you think this specific harm or this specific benefit is in fact the harm or benefit that the judges should decide the debate on, right? So you need to go the extra mile and always ask yourself, why, right? So don't just be satisfied with saying, okay, I've proven the harm, I've proven the benefit. Okay, but why should I care if this harm or benefit exists? So go that extra mile and tell me, how many people does this impact? Even if it impacts smaller people, why does it impact them in ways that we just cannot ignore it, right? I think that's a really good way to think about how to make your argument more important. Lastly, is why is this harm or benefit exclusive to your team? The reason why I say this and have included this is because you don't want to end up spending so much time explaining all of the 5 steps that we've gone through thus far, only to find out that none of what you've said is exclusive to your side. And you get an opponent that just comes up and says, that's not mutually exclusive. So what that term really means is that it's not exclusive to your side. It is something that can exist in their side of the world as well. So what you want to do is provide the mutual exclusivity of your point. Explain to the judge why this benefit only happens in your world, specifically only because of your policy. What is the unique perspective of your policy that has never existed in any of the pre-existing policies in the debate or in this world that you're, or context that you're speaking about? So always identify the unique perspective that you are adding to the debate that has never existed before. So I think these are the 6 steps that I think would help you have a starting point to think of a more solid argument than you would have otherwise thought of. I think an easy hack to kind of remember how to go through these steps is to think like a salesperson, right? The reason why I say this is because if we were to go along with the parallel earlier on, which is that argument construction or argument development is very, very much like building a house, in terms of needing to make sure that your foundation and your links are all very solid. Another way to think about it is also, once you have that house, how do you sell it to a judge? Like, how do you sell it to a buyer, right? So think of someone coming over to your house and you are the seller, you're the real estate agent, and you want to sell this old house to a buyer. When a buyer walks through the door, you want to make sure that you're telling them the background story of the house. You want to give the house a bit more character. If you want to sell a house at a steep price, you want to justify the price. You need to tell the buyer the whole picture and the starting point of it all, explaining why it is that certain changes were even necessary to begin with, right? So always provide a background story to the house. Second is, you can't just merely sell unbelievable stories, right? Like, you obviously need to explain why the background story of the house is true. How did the old owners of the house think? What drove their decisions? Why did they buy the house with this initial price and then currently they want to sell it for a higher price? What were the renovations that they made? Why were those renovations necessary? How did they feel prior to that renovation and after that renovation? Point is, like, you always want to explain why those background stories were true to begin with, right? And insert in a lot of your own specialized knowledge as the seller of this house. Thirdly is, what are the pros and cons? So again, as I've mentioned before, if in debate land, this is what rookie debaters tend to immediately jump into. And if you want to sound a lot more refined, you make this your 3rd step, because you want to make sure that you've already provided a background story. And the same parallel can be said about selling a house, right? Rookie house sellers, they just immediately jump to the pros and cons of the house, but you don't want to be a rookie house seller. You want to show that you're a much more polished house seller. So what you do is that you provide, a bit more context before jumping into the pros and cons of that house. And then after you've done that, you want to explain, how do these pros and cons happen, right? You want to paint a picture. So what you want to do now is not just say that oh, you have really great kitchen counters. You don't want to stop there. You want to make sure that the buyer really imagines themselves not being able to live without this kitchen counter. So you want to walk through with them what a life, what a day-to-day life living in that house with that fantastic kitchen counter actually looks like. So same rule here, right? Like walk through them. Why does this pro matter so much? Which walks us nicely into point 5, which is, why is this pro important? Right? Many different houses have many different perks. Why is this the perk that I can't live without? So if before you are painting a picture of how I interact with that perk, you move on to, why can't I live without this particular perk of this house? And then lastly is, why is this pro or con exclusive? Make sure that other sellers don't get to say that the pros of your house is not exclusive to you, that they have the same perk down at the house that they're selling at a much cheaper price. You don't want that to happen. And the same thing works for cons as well. You don't want to, because you always want to be comparative, right? And I'll get to that in a second, which is, you don't just want to say, here are the benefits of my case, or here are the pros of this house I'm selling. You also want to pitch it against the other house that the buyer is considering, right? You want to say, the con thing about that house or the harms about my opponent's case is, and then you go through it and make sure that these harms or these cons are exclusive to their side. Okay, so you're creating that clear delineation between, here are the great things about my house and my case, and here are the bad things about their house and their case. So I think that's a good way to look at it. I mean, at the end of the day, debating is all about the art of persuasion. And actually a real life example of where persuading skills really help you is when you're trying to convince someone and you're trying to sell an item. So yeah, think of yourself as a salesperson the next time you go into a debate. So the difference between debate arguments and public speaking arguments, or any kind of argument that you see as an activity that exists out there, is the need to be comparative. So as I've mentioned before, you never want to just stand there in a debate and say, here are all of the great things about my case. You always want to pitch it and say, not just why it's good, but why it's better in comparison to the argument presented by the other side of the house. My benefits are more important as opposed to it's important. Both could be equally important, your arguments and your opponents. But I, as a judge, need to decipher which argument is more important than the other. So always insert in the element of comparisons. Now, I've inserted here a little interaction between government and opposition, because you'll see here that Prime Minister will present points, and then you have a leader of opposition that will try to explain why their points are more important than Prime Minister's. Then DPM will have to come in and say, no, here are some of the rebuttals to LO and why Prime Minister's arguments are still in fact important. And on top of that, I'm adding on other arguments that are also important and more important than LO. And then DLO comes in and rebuts those arguments and tries to redefend leader of opposition, and so on and so forth. So I think the great thing about debating is that the arguments always end up becoming a lot more robust and dynamic because they're ever evolving. So if an argument exists and it comes under attack, you can't just represent that argument as if it never came under attack. So again, using the house example, you can't just go on living with a house that's constantly being attacked, right? And place back the same materials that have been attacked. You need to insert in newer material. You need to put in a little bit more repair work. So I think you need to evolve along with the attacks that have been thrown at you. So I think that's an important thing to remember as you're going through debates, which is you always need to redevelop arguments. You always need to redevelop rebuttals. You always need to move along with the debate. Do not remain stagnant. If you remain stagnant in your arguments and your rebuttals and you're not evolving, that's a bad indicator that you're going to be in trouble by the end of the debate. All right, so next we're going to go into speaker roles. So the skeleton of second speaker's speech is that, first off, you want to deal with any definitional challenges from the opponents. So let's say you are the Deputy Prime Minister. Your first speaker already gave definitions. The Leader of Opposition then provides a definitional challenge. Then if you are the second speaker on government side, so you're the Deputy Prime Minister, don't ignore that definitional challenge, right? You need to address it, rebut it, and explain why your team's initial definition is in fact the correct one, right? It can get a little bit messy. I believe that this has been quite extensively addressed in Lecture 1. So I do highly encourage you to watch Lecture 1, as I think the whole bit about definition does require some time for you to go through. And then after you're done with dealing with definitional challenges, the second thing is to go through rebuttals. So any rebuttals that you think are not included in your arguments, then just outline them straight off and present those rebuttals there and then. And then you can go into your new material or your arguments. Again, as mentioned before, this is not the only way second speakers can present their speech, but this is a good foundation or starting point for you to learn on how to perfect or internalize a second speech structure. So the question then becomes, what constitutes new material? So there are 3 different kinds of material that I've chosen to outline in this lecture, which is number 1, extension material, number 2, responsive material, and number 3, completely new material. So let's firstly go through extension material. Now, extension material tends to be arguments that are an extension of a pre-existing argument made by a previous speaker. So this means that if your previous speaker was talking about how, going back to the motion just now on legalizing gambling, how legalizing gambling can provide for a safer avenue for people to gamble, because a lot of people, have taken up all sorts of loans from like illegal ways for you to obtain loans that have really detrimental interest rates, and how you will better be able to deal with that, basically, right? Just make the whole environment surrounding gambling a lot safer. And maybe you as a second speaker have thought of a different way to conclude this, but still proving the point that you make gambling overall safer for people. I would consider this an extension material, right? You can conclude and impact it differently. So basically what you're doing is that you're using a lot of the same starting points, right? You are coming off the starting point that gambling used to not be very safe for people, and why that's true. And then you found different ways to build harms and benefits from there. And then you're just adding more layers of analysis as to why the argument is true and important. Remember, going back to the 2 things that I said earlier on the key features that will help you make your arguments more solid, no matter which part of the argument you are at, is by going through those 2 guiding questions. Is this argument true? And is this argument important? So that's on extension material. Going on to responsive material. Now, responsive material are arguments that are built from a rebuttal, right? Because when you think about it, some rebuttals may have many layers to it and be built in a way that is very similar to a typical argument. So if I were to go back, right, to steps to an argument development, which is, what is your starting point? Is your starting point true? What are the harms and benefits? How do these harms and benefits happen? Why is it important and why is it exclusive? You can do the exact same thing for rebuttals, right? And this is a perfect way to translate rebuttals into and make them new material. Because I've come across some second speakers that go, I don't have many points, because a lot of the points that were important, we've already passed on to the first speaker, which tends to happen in prep, right? The more important arguments, you tend to forward them to the first speaker. So as a second speaker, you need to be a little bit more creative on how to come up with material. So I think a good way to come up with that material is to come up with responsive material. So don't just take a rebuttal and then just treat it as, okay, I just need to think of like one or two things to say to debunk this argument from the opponents. No, take full advantage of that opportunity by building that rebuttal from scratch and following these steps, because then you can make that rebuttal a lot more solid, a lot more detrimental for the other side, and it basically gives rise to a new argument, which is responsive material. So thirdly is completely new material. I think this is quite self-explanatory, which is that it is a completely distinct argument with a new starting point, with new links, new conclusions, and impacts. So the same steps that we mentioned before about argument development, those 6 steps, yeah, you're just doing it all over again, just for like a whole completely new set of points. So yeah, these are like the 3 I think starting points that you can think of when it comes to identifying what are new materials. So for second and third speakers, there's often this dilemma of how do you decide when to bring back your team's points? So I think you identify if your team's starting points of arguments or causal links have been rebutted. I think this is a good method of identification, right? So you want to ask yourself if the very foundation of your teammates' arguments, right, the starting point is being attacked, right? The other side is like, no, none of that is true. And we think that a lot of the harms or benefits just don't stand because the premise of their argument is not true. You don't want to let them get away with that, right? So what you want to do is you want to rebuild that starting point. You want to evolve and give new reasons as to why your starting point is true, right? And then secondly is the causal links, which is the process. How do people behave? If your opponents come up and they say, the reason why your benefit is not likely is because people just don't behave that way. Instead, people behave in A, B, C ways. You need to come back and rebut and respond to those rebuttals by the opponents, right? You need to go and say, nope, the links still stand because of these new reasonings. So I think a good way to think about whether or not you need to bring back points is to think on whether or not those points have been interacted with by the other side. If they have, you don't want to let them have the last say. So you got to come back, bring back those points and redefend them by evolving and adapting those points. Now, given that third speakers are highly discouraged from bringing new material, how do third speakers then bring back a point without sounding like you're bringing new material or sounding like you're merely just repeating your teammates? I think a good way to do this is that you identify which part of your opponent's arguments and rebuttals are damaging to the argument you want to bring back, and then attack that particular material. So for example, you have point A that has been presented by your first or second speaker. Opponents come in and provide rebuttals to that. What you as a third speaker are doing is re-rebutting these points, right? You're rebutting those points, and then after you're done rebutting those specific material brought by your opponents that was meant to attack your teammates, after you are done with that, then you bring back your teammates' points and go, and this is exactly why my teammates' points still stands. So I think that's a good way of bringing back that point without sounding like you're merely repeating, but at the same time, you're still fulfilling your role as a responsive rebuttal speaker. So the next question is then, how do you develop rebuttals, right? So there are several ways. So I put this diagram specifically in this way is because there is no chronological way to go about it, right? These are just some of the different approaches that you can adopt. Firstly is you can attack your opponent's steps to their argument development. So for example, remember those 6 steps I mentioned earlier on. If you have internalized that, it's very likely that your opponents have internalized that as well. So if you are trying to rebut their arguments, look at those steps that they've built and ask yourself, which point is most crucial for me to debunk? Is it the starting point of that argument? Or is it the causal links of those arguments? Or is it the fact that that argument is just not important to begin with? Or the fact that that argument is just not exclusive to them? And you don't have to do only one, right? You can do all four of them. It purely depends on how much time you have and what is the kind of analysis that they have provided. And you basically want to prioritize based on that, right? Because some arguments, it's like, yeah, I guess it's true. They've basically proven it's true. It's kind of really hard to explain why it's not true. But what I can do is explain to the judges that even if it's true, it's just not important. It's not debate winning, or it's just not mutually exclusive to their side. So that's one of the ways you can develop a rebuttal. The second way you can develop a rebuttal is to focus on the key areas of that argument, right? So if the first method that I just explained is a little bit more meticulous, if you want to go through just like two easy things to remember, go back to the key features of an argument that I mentioned earlier on, which is this true? Is this important? Use those two things and you'll be fine, right? So if you're using those two questions to develop your own argument, you'll use those two questions to say why their other side is very problematic in the way that they've developed their argument. The third way is to have an objective when rebutting, right? Because not everything needs to be rebutted. So I think a really important thing to remember is that you need to practice prioritization, because there are some arguments that I think is quite silly when sold by the other side, and like you're looking at the judge and you're like, even the judge is laughing, like nobody buys the argument, right? These situations tend to happen. You can spend some time rebutting it, but don't spend all of your time rebutting that. Instead, spend time on rebutting the arguments that are much more damaging to your side. And I've always personally believed this, which is whichever argument sounds the most persuasive from the other side, to the point where even you're sitting down and you're like, oh man, that actually sounds really compelling and I don't know how to rebut that, therefore I don't want to rebut that. That's actually probably a really good indicator that that is the exact argument you need to rebut. Because if you find it persuasive and you're sitting on the opposing side, it's very likely that the judges that are meant to be sitting on a neutral side find it even more persuasive and even more compelling. So I think that's a good indicator to decide that that is exactly the thing that I need to rebut on. So the question then becomes, I know what to rebut, but how do I develop those rebuttals? Then you go back to the steps that I've presented, which is ask yourself, is this argument true? Is this argument important? Is this mutually exclusive? What are the links that are missing in this argument? And don't just say like, oh, this link is missing, right? Explain why the missing link makes it damaging to the debate. And then lastly is to compare your team's arguments and rebuttals versus your opponent's arguments and rebuttals. I think being comparative really adds a strategic element to debating that truly differentiates between a debater that is just starting out and a debater that is slightly more refined, right? It's always that element of being a lot more comparative in comparison to the other speakers in the room. So another thing is that in debating, we highly encourage everyone to always expand your knowledge, right? Read lots of books, listen to all sorts of podcasts. But then the question is, where do you insert in all of these specialized knowledge, right? Like, I've read up on so much, so where exactly in my speech do I show all this new knowledge that I've gained? Commonly, you insert them in the background story of your arguments and the causal links of your arguments. So whenever you're explaining about why this background story is true, and you're kind of answering the questions of like, how do people think? What are the driving factors behind why this story is true, or what are the driving factors behind why people decide a certain way to ensure that they will adhere to this policy that will allow a lot of your harms or benefits to materialize. A lot of that can be based on the things that you've read, right? And it doesn't just apply to like actual human beings and how they live and how they think, but even institutions, right? If you've read up books on financial institutions and how they behave, and what are they most receptive and reactive to, include that in the causal links of your arguments if it's an econs motion, right? If you have very specific knowledge on how NGOs work or how governments work when it comes to implementing bills, implementing new laws, include that in the causal links of your arguments, right? So I think these are perfect opportunities for you to insert in all of that good stuff that you've gained from reading and watching all sorts of educational videos. So we have all of these layers and analysis, but one thing we should never forget is structure. Because I think in absence of structure, judges are just going to be so lost listening to all of this analysis and therefore will not get the purpose that you intend out of all of that analysis. So some good tips for better structure is to firstly remember signposting. So what this means is that you need to be clear to the judges when you are moving from one argument to another and when you are explaining the subparts to an argument. So for example, say to the judge, the reason why this argument is true is because, and then your reasoning. Or the second reason why this argument is important is because, and then the explanation. So those 6 steps that I mentioned earlier on, don't be shy to literally tell the judge, this is my claim, this is the reason why this premise is true, right? Premise, background story, why this premise is true. Here are my benefits. Here is why I think my benefits are true. And there are 3 reasons why. And then over and done with that, here are reasons why my benefits are important. And there are 3. And lastly, panel, here's the reason why this benefit is exclusive to our side of the house. So really flag to the judges as you are moving from one argument to another. It may feel a little bit robotic at first, but I feel like it's better to be safe than sorry. I think once you've internalized clarity, you'll eventually find your own way of moving through those arguments in a much more structured way, in a way that feels more you and less robotic. But I think a good starting point is to remember signposting. Secondly, is to juxtapose your points. So what I mean by this is that narrate to the judges what your point is doing to beat down your opponent's arguments. So for example, if you have a rebuttal and that rebuttal is meant to bring down very specific points from the opposition, as you are going through that rebuttal, tell the judge. And this is why when side opposition said, and then summarize the claim that they are making, it doesn't stand because of reasons 1, 2, 3. So you're directly showing the judges the arrow between your responsive material and the argument that you are specifically responding to. Because in absence of this, I feel like if you don't juxtapose your points, judges will feel like, okay, this is a good rebuttal, but they can't truly grasp the magnitude of this rebuttal because they don't know extensively what is this rebuttal responding to. So don't rely on the judges, right? Do it for the judges. So the judges have no excuse but to realize that the purpose of this rebuttal is to do X, Y, and Z. Lastly, is to narrate the purpose of your point, your arguments or your rebuttals, right? Everything you say in your 7-minute speech should have a purpose in forwarding your case to win the debate, right? So if you have an argument and you feel like this argument is really debate winning, link it back to the initial burden that I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture, which is what are the key burdens all of your arguments are meant to prove. Link it back to that. Whenever you have a rebuttal and you want to make sure that the whole point of this rebuttal is to say that this very specific point that side opposition has hinged their entire case on has now fallen, say that to the judge, right? Say that this is therefore the debate winning rebuttal because, and then explain that. And I think this is where you hear the term meta-debating. Meta-debating here just means that you're not just debating the topic, but you're debating the key elements and the strategies that you have adopted in the debate. So you're literally narrating to the judge what is happening, what are the interactions between these arguments. And I think that would be especially helpful from a strategy point of view in helping judges understand your argument, but also helps build a better structure for your speeches. Having said that, we're now going to go into the example of a first speaker speech. We're not going to go through the entirety of the 7-minute speech, but I will show you the first half of that speech, just so that you get a little bit more of an idea of what a first speaker speech is meant to look like. Okay.
Grand final motion is: this House believes that it is unjustified for collaborators to assist evil regimes in systematically persecuting members of the identity group in order to mitigate and moderate the regime's abuses. And we list 2 examples. Good luck to all teams. If there are no questions about understanding all this, I'd now like to invite the Prime Minister to speak for the motion, which will bear the name. Am I audible? In World War II, France collaborated with the Nazi regime so that part of the Nazi dominion is controlled by them. These are the type of behaviors that we are against in opening government. Because in opening government, we believe that when there are oppression, your duty as an identity group is not to be a collaborator, betraying your own group and betraying your own people that will be abused day to day, but to stand in opposition to the atrocities of the regime. We say that we must revolt, we must fight back, and we think that this is what is moral to do. We're going to prove what should be the moral standard in fighting oppression, and I'm going to talk about 3 things. Number 1, I'm going to begin by talking about who's the beneficiary of the collaboration. Number 2, I'm going to explain what's the comparative if we choose not to collaborate at all. And number 3, lastly, why the comparative, the trade-off at the end of the day is something that's worth it. Let's begin with who is the beneficiary of the collaboration. I'm going to begin by dispelling the myth that being a collaborator will make your identity group better off, because we say that that's a lie. You are not going to be better off as an identity group. Why is this the case? How do evil regimes work? How do evil regimes oppress people, ladies and gentlemen? You need to understand that as an evil regime, your end goal is to seek for profit. You plunder resources, and this is something inherent that at the end of the day, all evil regimes will always put fear on these identity group by continuously killing them so that they are afraid of revolting and taking back power to the hands of the people. That evil regime will always force many of the oppressed group to be a forced labor, working for free, guaranteeing that their oppression machine can continue. So the question is, who benefit? Because we will concede that there might be a moderation of the oppression, but the question is, who will be the beneficiary of that moderation? We say that the beneficiary will be exclusive to the well-connected, the leaders of the minority group, those that are rich, those that are privileged, those that held the seats of power, like the nobles, for example. We say that these are people who are privileged enough, and we say that it is unlikely that the moderation of oppression will any be different, right? Why is this something inherent? Obviously, because if you as a leader, even if you choose to be a collaborator, even if you choose to push less and less discrimination and less abuse, we say that it is impossible that the regime will ever follow you, and to choose to extend the moderation to other people who are not part of the privilege. Why? Number one, because at that point, the regime are unable to benefit fully from the oppression, right? Because when they choose to oppress your people, when they choose to acquire all this free labor, if they choose to no longer do it, then they take away the biggest source of their profit. But secondly, note that in the event that they choose to comply with you, that they have less and less oppression coming to your people, then they will feel that their authority is threatened, right? It is beginning to be taken away by you at the end of the day. That's why they are unlikely to be able and to want to comply and reduce the amount of oppression. What is the meaning of all this? The meaning is that it is something inherent within every collaboration that the most vulnerable will keep on getting oppressed. And I think that there are lots of study cases for this, right? When Indonesian nobles made deals with Japan, the oppression happens at the end of the day. The abuse continues to happen to the poor on the nations, and it is only the nobles that are free. We think that at that point, the beneficiary is extremely limited and exclusive to a certain set of people. Before I move on, yes.
I think it's highly uncomparative because I believe in their side of the house, there will be more fear, more oppression, and there will be highly more likely to be violent to them. I prefer my side of the house be comparative.
Yeah, what's the comparative, right? Let's move to my second argument. The comparative is taking the fight to them.
All right. Right. So I wanted to go through a bit of a speech breakdown from what we just saw, right? So I think the speaker had a really persuasive opening line where the speaker illustrates the worldview that speaker is trying to defend. They outline the arguments that they are going to present so that the judges can kind of like take note of what are the claims that they are trying to make so that later on it becomes easier for the judges to track. And then the speaker went into the claim. And I think most importantly, the speaker goes into an explanation of the processes, right? Like, and really goes into deep characterization of the stakeholders that the speaker is trying to refer to. And I think the speaker even makes an attempt at prioritization. And we see this when the speaker talks about how they're willing to concede in some stuff. However, that is less important in comparison to the thing that the speaker wants the judges to focus on, right? And I think this is a perfect example of where the speaker uses strategy to show prioritization via concessions. And then last but not least, the speaker talks about comparatives. I think some of the claims and straight up the big hitters of the arguments that the speaker wants to present is just straight up about comparatives. The speaker always talks about how, whether things are going to be more harmful or what is the more important onus that the stakeholders need to pick up on. And we even see comparatives even in the POI, right? When the opposing side said that, literally asks the speaker to be comparative and says that, don't you think that, more harms are more likely to happen in your world? So I think this is a perfect example how even in that small clip, in that very short clip, we were able to see that immediately there are comparatives that occur from the offset of the debate. So yeah, and if anything, the way in which the speaker responds to that POI is by trying to do that in their subsequent material. We obviously didn't get to finish up on that, and I highly do encourage you, the viewers, to watch the entirety of the debate. That was the EFL finals at WUDC Cape Town 2019. To see how the arguments played out and maybe even practice your judging by seeing which team you found more compelling as opposed to which team actually ended up winning the debate, right? Like you can compare and contrast your point of views and kind of study a little bit of the debate via there. But going back to the speaker responding to that POI via their second material, I think this is another perfect example of where even when prime ministers don't have a speaker to directly respond to because they are literally the first speaker in the debate, I think by virtue of saying that, I will respond to that via my second argument, it kind of already makes that second argument not just a completely new material, but also responsive material. I also do think another way that prime ministers can make their arguments somewhat a responsive material is by including in preemptions as part and parcel of that. But yeah, I think this is a good example of where we saw some of the things that we've learned in this lecture actually be implemented in an actual first speaker speech. Lastly, some final remarks. I just want to remind everybody that this lecture, again, does not function as an exhaustive list of how to approach argument development. Instead, it functions to provide basic foundation for that argument development. But again, like I said before, I do think that this is a good kind of starting point for you to start internalizing a lot of the basic structures and basic steps towards argument construction until you eventually get into your own groove of figuring out what best works for you along with your own style. Yeah. And I also just wanted to remind everybody that if you do have any questions, please, please, please don't be shy to message us, whether on the Australasian Debate Training Initiative Facebook group, or even just like message me directly on Facebook, which is under my full name, Ameera Natasha Moore. The spelling is at the beginning of this lecture. And if I don't respond immediately, I'm so sorry, it's probably in my filtered messages, but I will try to be as responsive as quickly as possible. Yes, and also before I forget, I believe Sharmila, a lecturer in the first lecture, mentioned how we're supposed to tell the audience about a book that we're currently reading. So the book that I'm currently reading is a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking About Race to White People. And it's by, and I really hope that I'm pronouncing this right, Rennie Edo-Lodge. It's a really good book that talks about race, the dynamics between African descendants, people of color, and white people. The context is within the UK. I say this because I think usually people assume that if a book is talking about people of color, especially involving Black people, they assume that it's within an African-American context, whereas this one talks less about America and more about the UK. But nevertheless, I do think that it addresses very important universal issues about race. So yeah, do check it out. And that's it from me. Thank you.